we have today Ashley Brantley. She is our Muscogee County A&R agent. So she does what I do, but in Muscogee County. So she was previously in Ware County for a couple of years as a 4-H agent, but she has recently moved to Columbus and is serving in horticultural areas and container gardening and home vegetable gardening and things like that. So before we start, just a couple housekeeping things. Some of y'all have heard this. You cannot see each other and you are muted, so go ahead and eat your lunch. We are taking questions, topic-specific questions in the Q&A. And if you have, if you want to say thank you or you want to throw a comment out there, we do have the chat. We do ask that, it stays relevant because we've got over 200 people on here now. So just kind of helps us corral everything. I do also see a lot of master gardeners on here. This is a great continuing education opportunity. So if you need some of that, if you want it to count for continuing education, I will be happy to verify your presence. Just kind of shoot me an email or put it in the chat that you attended, and then let your county agent know that you attended as well, and you'll get credit for that. So let's see. I think with that, oh yes, so chat is only to panelists. So that's if, you're having some sort of technical difficulties or something like that, the chat, you can only chat to us, but we may comment on it if something's happening, if one of us starts to break up or something. So with that, I'd also like to thank Richie and Beth who are on here. They are our IT wizards after kind of the snafu we had last week with so many people signing up, way over capacity. They have really come to our rescue with a secure Zoom environment. They're helping us manage social media. They have just really come through. They're going to help us moderate this session. We also have Ashley Hoppers, the Fannin and Gilmer County Extension agent. So she and I will be kind of hopping back and forth in the chat, making sure things are going well also. So with that, let's go ahead and start talking about vegetables with Ashley Brantley.
All right, so thank you so much, Melissa. Welcome everyone to the second session of the Container Gardening webinar series. As she mentioned, today I want to talk to you a little bit about growing vegetables in containers. So let's go ahead and get started by taking a look at location, containers, potting mix, and plants before we move on to planting, care and maintenance, and eventually harvest. So whether you are new to gardening or an experienced gardener, there are many reasons for growing vegetables in a container garden. From being limited on space to maybe you're looking for an option that's a little less work than your traditional in-ground vegetable garden. So whatever your reason for starting a container garden, make sure that you start small, especially if you're new to gardening. Container gardening has its own special set of circumstances that really need to be considered when using those for gardening. Also, make sure that you have a plan, and that's with any garden. You need to know what you're growing, when you're growing, and where you're going to grow it. Also, when it comes to growing vegetables, you want to make sure that you are really growing ones that you and your family enjoy. Nothing is better than growing a vegetable that you actually do not like and will not end up using it. And then lastly, but certainly not least, make sure that you have the right foundation. And we're going to talk about these a little more in depth. So one of the very first components of a good foundation when it comes to container gardening is looking at location. So where do you have space? Is that on a balcony? Is that on a back patio? Maybe it's your driveway or even your doorstep. A few things to keep in mind, though, is to be mindful of stains, which can inevitably be a problem with container gardening. Also, if you live in an apartment setting, you want to be mindful of your neighbors, especially with water drainage issues and heat as well. Unfortunately, with cement and brick, heat sinks can be a problem and can actually damage your plant. Always know your plant requirements too. So whether you're growing warm season vegetables, which are your tomatoes, your peppers, your cucumbers, things that fruit will actually need a lot of sunlight during the day, anywhere from 6 to 8 hours a day. Now, if you're growing cool season crops or vegetables such as lettuces or maybe root crops like radishes, you can get away with a few less hours, somewhere between 3 and 5, and it will not really affect your cropping habit. So keep that in mind, especially when you're looking at locations. And last, access to water. Now, when you are growing plants in a container, most of the time you can get away with using a water can or a water hose. But you want to make sure that you have that access to water, because one of the constraints with container gardening is that they will need to be checked regularly, and you will need to apply water quite frequently as well. So one of the main considerations is really going to be your container. What are you going to grow in? Is this going to be a permanent structure, or is this going to be more of a temporary one? Will this be something that you actually purchase from the store, or will it be something that you recycle, such as a milk jug or maybe a reusable shopping bag? One of the things that you want to keep in mind when deciding on what container to use for your vegetable container garden is that you want to stay away from treated wood products, and you want to also stay away from containers that have stored toxic chemicals in the past. Unfortunately, those can sometimes be leached to your plants. Now, there are a few things that you need to keep in mind when choosing a container. So it should really hold your potting mix or your potting soil. It should allow water to drain. Now, if your particular container does not already have drainage holes added to it, is it something that you can eventually add? A certain consideration needs to be put in place for that, because you're really going to want that water to be able to drain out of your container. Also, is your container large enough to support a fully grown plant? Something that you should keep in the back of your mind for proper root growth and development. Plants generally need anywhere from 6 to 8 inches. So will your plant be able to get that from the container that you use? Also, is it made of a permeable material such as wood, ceramic, or clay? If they are made out of these particular materials, they will actually dry out faster, and you'll find yourself needing to water these a little more regularly than, say, a glass container. Also, is it of a dark color like black? These tend to heat up faster than, say, lighter colors such as greens and yellows. So let's go ahead and look at some of the most popular plants that are grown in containers and what size containers you will need for these particular plants. So the very first one on our list is broccoli. Now for broccoli, you will need roughly a 2-gallon size container, and this will be roughly about an 8 to 10 inch pot, and you can generally get one plant in this size container. Now, if you scoot down the list a little bit, you'll see for carrots, you can actually get 2 to 3 plants in about a 1 gallon. Now, if you increase the size on that, of course, you can get a few more plants fitted in as well. I'm going down the list a little bit for some of your larger plants like tomato and squash. You want to make sure that those particular plants have about a 5-gallon container for proper growth and development. Pepper as well is another one that will need a larger container. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about location in containers, another really important component when getting started is potting mix. Now, these actually go by a lot of different names. There are a lot of different options to choose from as well. If you've ever walked through a garden center, typically there is a wall of nothing but potting mix, mulch, compost. It goes on and on. And so when it comes to selection time, you really want to know what the function of your potting mix is going to be. What is going to be its purpose? And really, this is threefold. So the very first one and the most important one is that it's going to supply your roots and eventually your plant with the air, water, and nutrients that it needs. It's also going to support your root growth and development. And lastly, it's going to serve as an anchor for your plant or a foundation, something that will eventually support it and help it grow. something to anchor to. All right, so our very first potting mix that is on the list is one that I typically get a lot of questions about, and that is garden soil or soil that you will find in your yard. Now, generally, this is not recommended for use in containers, and there are a lot of reasons for this, with the most popular one being that it holds on to moisture and nutrients and can actually suffocate your root in your container. And that is something we're really not looking forward to when trying to grow vegetable crops in containers. Also, these are typically riddled with weed seeds, and they can possibly carry diseases as well, which can be problems for your plants in the long run and maintenance issues. And lastly, garden soil is heavy. And if you're wanting to move your containers around, this is going to make it a lot more challenging for you. All right, so the next consideration or type is synthetic or soil-less mixes. Now, as the name suggests, these do not have garden soil in them, but they are a good choice for containers, and that is because they're lightweight, they typically drain well, and they also hold on to nutrients in water. These are also weed and disease free, which is a plus. Now, these typically contain a mixture of some different components from peat moss, wood chips, perlite, and vermiculite. As you notice, there is no soil generally in these mixes. And perlite and vermiculite might sound like some weird ingredients, but all those really are heated up minerals that will add some pore space to your material. Now, depending on which one you go with, these may or may not have fertilizer added. You should really check your bag. So the next one is actually a soil mix. And the only difference between soil mixes and soil-less mixes is that soil mixes will contain a pasteurized soil. These actually have a better water holding capacity than your soil-less mixes. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of other options when you are choosing a potting mix type. They can say topsoil, potting soil, planting mix. You'll really want to check the ingredients on these particular ones, see what they're made out of, because the quality will differ with each one. You'll also want to make sure that you stay away from any that seem heavy or clump forming. These just will not perform well in a container. All right, so the last one that I really want to mention is compost. Now, compost can be used as an add-in or as a potting mix itself. For those of you who might not be familiar with compost, compost is really decayed plant material. You can actually either make your own or you can purchase it at some of your local garden centers and nurseries. Now, these are usually weed-free as long as they reach the temperatures that they need to, as well as disease-free. They also contain some nutrients. However, most of the time they're not released in a timely manner, and you will need to typically add some fertilizer along with this. So let's talk a little bit more about potting mix types and the different combinations that you can make. Now, you can actually use 100% soil-less potting mix or even 100% compost, or if you have some different things laying around, you can actually make your own formulations, and it's really based off of your preference in your situation. And so don't feel like you have to use 100% of one thing or 100% of something else. There's a lot of different combinations and variations that you can come up with that will all perform well in a container. Now, before we move on to plants, let's take a look at a potting mix bag that my husband actually picked up for me at one of the local garden centers here in town. I actually didn't give him a lot of instructions on what to pick up. I just said, pick up a bag, something similar to what we had last time. And this is actually something that he brought home. And so I wanted us to just take a minute and look at this bag and some of the things that it mentions. So as you'll see on the top left-hand corner on the left-hand picture, it says it's made with compost, which seems great. It's also for vegetables and herbs. It has moisture control, and it will feed up to 3 months. So it means that there is some fertilizer added. If you flip it over and look at the back, the picture on the right, you will see instructions for use, you know, how many bags you'll need for certain size areas. You'll also notice ingredients in the bottom left-hand corner. And I know you can't really see it, but one of the very first ingredients is peat, with the second ingredient being a forestry product. Now, that kind of sent off a red flag for me. I also looked at the fertilizer ratios and how long this is supposedly going to feed for. Before I looked over to the right-hand side, next to the peppers and the tomatoes, you will see it says for in-ground use. You will also see a picture of a container with a slash through it too. This particular mix is actually not suitable for containers, and the peat and the forestry product on the ingredients list again set off a red flag, but seeing that emblem and seeing for the in-ground use, we know that this is probably not the best option. So I wanted to share this with you as an example. Please make sure that you're reading packages before you use them in your containers. So I'm sure most of you are wondering, what can I grow in a container? Well, actually, you can grow most of the vegetables that you typically grow in an in-ground garden situation in a container. You do want to be mindful that those that take up less space are actually better suited, such as dwarf varieties or bush types. And so smaller vegetables like carrots do well, lettuce, bush tomatoes, and things like that. Now, this is a list of some of the common or most popular vegetables that do well in containers. As you can see, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, green onions. I won't read the list, but there are quite a few. But don't feel like these are the only ones that you can grow in a container. Feel free to experiment. Some people say that potatoes don't do well in containers, but I actually grew some red skin potatoes in a storage container this spring season, and they did well. People have also been able to grow melons and things like that in containers. So if you have the space, feel free to experiment. As you can see, cucumbers and pole beans do well. They will, again, take up some space, but as long as you have some kind of support where they can grow up instead of out, they will do well if you are limited. But definitely make sure whatever you decide to grow that you're choosing cultivars that actually do well in your area. And if you're unsure about this, you can always check with your local extension office. All right, so here's a list that I actually took from the UGA Extension vegetable planting chart. So if you're here in Georgia, these are some ones that will actually do well here in our area. If you noticed on my chart, I decided to put the bush varieties for certain ones, such as beans and cucumbers. But again, all lettuces will do well when it comes to squash. Any summer squash, zucchini will do well here in Georgia. Peppers like Big Bertha, colossal karma, lettuce, butterhead, romaine, butter crunch. So there are lists out there that will tell you which ones will do well in your area. And again, try to make sure for your containers that you stay with plants that take up less space and look for dwarf or more bush types. All right, so when you are choosing your plants, whether it be seeds or transplants, you want to make sure that these are disease-free. You can actually grow your own or you can purchase it from reputable garden center in India. When it comes to container gardening, it is highly recommended, if possible, to start with transplants. Just because they seem to perform better in a container situation. So when you're purchasing transplants from either garden center or your local nursery, make sure that you purchase ones that appear healthy and don't look weak or stressed. Now, keep in mind certain vegetables, such as your beans, your peas, your root vegetables, these do not do well as transplants, and these will actually need to be directly seeded into your containers. All right, so here you will see the back image or picture of a seed packet. So if you do decide to start from seed for growing your transplants, make sure that you read this information before you get started. There's a lot of helpful tidbits on the back. And so if you look at the picture, you will see that this is a bush form of blue lake pole beans. You will also see on the right-hand side of the picture the sow schedule. So if you're sowing these outside, according to the map, when is the best time in your area? And you'll find Georgia and you can reference back to that color. Also, it will tell you how deep to sow your seeds, how far spaced, how far apart, excuse me, they need to be spaced, how long you have to wait until germination and harvest, any other growth requirements that are special for your particular crop. And also at the very bottom of the package, you will find what the date was that they were packaged for. And for this particular picture, it was 2017. So now that it's 2020, this would probably not be the best option for your seeds. You really want to make sure when you're buying seeds that you check for the packed by date and make sure that it is your current year. Unfortunately, with seeds, they lose viability and they also decrease in their germination rate the older the seeds are. Now, when you are growing seedlings for transplants for your container garden, you really want to make sure that you're starting at least 6 to 8 weeks before you plan on planting these in your container. When it comes to seed germination, the best mix to use is a soilless mix that does not have fertilizer. This is always the best option. You want to make sure that it has a good tilt to it too, and it's not something that is clump forming. Again, make sure that you are using this particular mix, whether it be in a tray, cell pack peat pots, or you can even purchase peat pellets now that do well for seed germination. After sowing your seeds and watering them in, these should really be placed in a warm space and one that receives plenty of sunlight. Again, make sure to check out the back of your seed packet so you're following that really helpful information that they have supplied you with. All right, so once your seedlings have developed, you want to make sure that they have at least 2 to 3 sets of true leaves and a good strong root system before you move them to your container. Something to keep in mind, however, before you move them on to their final setting place, you want to make sure that these are hardened off. Now, what this is a process where you're going to acclimate your seedlings to the outdoor weather conditions before actually transplanting them in your container. And what this is going to do is this is going to harden them or toughen them up for the growing season. And so you're less likely going to have issues with them when they are adjusting in your container. So this is a very important step, hardening off, and one that people often forget to do. All right, so now we know a little bit about getting started with your container garden. Let's look at planting. So something to keep in mind that when you're planting vegetables in containers, these should really be planted at the same time as they would in a typical in-ground garden situation. So if you're growing warm season vegetables, make sure that you're waiting to roughly around tax day before you're putting these out. Now, again, this will depend on your location, whether you're in Georgia or in another state. So make sure that you're really checking this information, and this can be found again on the back of your seed packet if you're directly sowing seeds, on your transplant tag, or you can even check through your local extension office. But it's really important that you stick with those same time frames when planting in a container. Now, before you fill your container with potting mix, you always want to double check your drainage holes. So for this particular pot, this is one I purchased a couple weeks back, and I actually had to drill the drainage holes in the bottom. And most of the containers, the plastic ones that you purchase now, you will actually have to drill the holes yourself. So make sure that those are in there and they're ready to go before you actually fill it up with potting mix. Now, when you're filling it up with potting mix, you generally want to stay about 1 to 2 inches below the container rim, and you want to make sure that you're not packing it in the container. Now, you can actually settle the potting mix by gently tapping it on the ground, but you want to make sure that you're not really packing it in. You want to make sure that you still have some airspace available with your potting mix. Now, when it comes to planting, such as sowing your seeds and setting your transplants, you really want to follow those instructions that are again found on the seed packet or on your transplant tag. A general rule of thumb when you are sowing seeds, those will be sowed to a depth that is 2 to 3 times the diameter of the seed. So if you're sowing a seed that has a diameter roughly of 1/4 of an inch, you're going to want to sow it to a depth of anywhere from 1/2 an inch to about 3/4 of an inch. Now, transplant, you typically want to make sure that the line of potting soil matches up with the line of potting mix in the transplant container, and you want to make sure that those two lines match evenly. Now, there is one exception to the rule, and that is with tomato plants. These will need to be planted deeper in your container so that they are allowed to develop a stronger root system, which will eventually give you a stronger tomato plant as well. So typically you want to bury these in your potting mix until about 1/3 to 1/2 of your tomato plant is visible above your potting mix line. And then you want to go back in and, of course, press down your potting mix gently around your transplant to make sure that it is settled in the potting mix. So after transplanting or sowing your seeds, you want to make sure that you're thoroughly soaking your potting mix with water. You want to make sure that you're filling the container and that the water is actually draining through your drainage holes in the bottom. If your particular vegetable plant that you are growing needs some kind of support, such as with tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, and beans, that you're supplying those early enough that you're not having to go back once the plant grows larger and put these in, because putting these in later, you could possibly damage the root systems for your particular vegetable crop. And the last step is really to make sure that you label your containers. Make sure that you're putting the name of your vegetable crop, and if it's a particular on some kind of tag, so you'll know when you go back to check your plant which one it is. And you also want to keep track of your date of planting as well. That way you can know roughly when harvest should be for that particular vegetable. All right, so now that we know a little bit more and we have our containers actually filled with either our seeds or our transplants, let's look at caring and maintaining these particular vegetable crops through the season, starting with fertilizing. So depending on which potting mix you decided to go with at the beginning of the season, you will eventually have to apply some type of fertilizer during the growing season. Now, if you started with a potting mix that already had fertilizer added, you can typically wait a few weeks before your first fertilizer application. But unfortunately, with this situation with container plants, you will have some nutrient leaching through the various waterings that you will have to supply to your containers. And so generally, after a few weeks, you will have to add some type of fertilizer. Now, if your potting mix did not have fertilizer already added when it was purchased, there are some different formulations that you can use. There's water soluble, there's also slow release. Those are the most popular ones out there that are available, but you also have organic options as well. So, as with anything, you definitely want to make sure that you follow your label directions on your fertilizer. Just because a little is good does not necessarily mean that a lot is better. So again, always make sure that you are following those label directions no matter which formulation you decide to use. So looking a little more in depth at the different ones that are available, one of the most common and most convenient ones is actually a water soluble formulation. And with this particular one, it comes in a powder or a granular formula, and you're going to add it to water, and then this will be poured over your potting mix in your container. And one of the reasons that it is so effective is because it is readily available to the plants at the watering. Now, if you are using this with a potting mix that did not already have fertilizer added, you can actually use this the day that you set the transplant. However, if you're sowing seeds in your container, you're going to want to wait until after germination before applying. And so typically throughout the growing season, these are applied every 2 to 3 weeks, depending on which formulation you're using. Now, looking at slow release, one of the advantages for this particular one is it's kind of a set it and forget it kind of formulation. And so these are typically pelletized or granular, and these can be incorporated or applied to the potting mix surface. And so with the slow release, these are going to gradually release nutrients throughout the growing season over a certain period of time. Now, these do have to be watered in for the nutrients to be available to the plants, so please do not forget that step. Again, at transplanting or planting, these can be incorporated into the potting mix at the day of planting, and they can generally last anywhere from 2 to 4 months, depending on which formulation you decide to go with. All right, so some other fertilizer options are out there. These are more organic in nature, whereas the water soluble and the slow release were more inorganic. So for the organic options, you have fish, you have sea kelp, and you have compost teas that can be used. These are typically mixed with water and then applied to the potting mix. Whereas you have some dry formulations that can also be used, such as composted manures, blood meal, cottonseed meal, and these will generally be incorporated into the potting mix at planting. So I have an example of some plant food that I actually have here at the house. As you can see in the picture on the left-hand side, it's an all-purpose water-soluble formula. After looking at the side panel, you can see which crops that you can use it on: fruit and vegetable, roses, trees and shrubs. And at the bottom, you can see the nutrient profile on this particular one. Now, on the other side, or on the right-hand picture, you will see directions for use. Again, this is a really convenient option because all you're doing is mixing 1 teaspoon of this particular formulation per gallon of water, and then you're going to apply it every 2 weeks. And so you're really just going to follow those directions. It also lets you know about outdoor plants, best results. And then a key note is at the very bottom at transplanting, you will see to help reduce shock, you want to apply this at half strength after planting. So there's little caveats in there. You want to make sure that you're paying attention to those when you are reading your label so you don't accidentally injure your plants when you're trying to supply them with some food for the growing season. All right, so besides supplying your plants with food, they're also going to need to be watered quite regularly. And so, especially once we start hitting some of the warmer months, summer, late summer, early fall, you're really going to want to be checking your containers quite frequently. And my recommendation is really to start now, start checking them daily to see if you need water. And one of the easiest ways to do that for me is with the finger test. And all you're really doing here is you are sticking your finger in your potting mix until your finger is about 1 inch into that potting mix. And then you're going to see if at the tip of your finger, if that potting mix seems dry or if it seems wet. If it seems dry, you're going to want to water. And when you do water, you're going to want to apply enough water. That water is coming out of the drainage holes at the bottom of your pot. And that's the only way to really know that your container has been full of or filled with water. And you're also going to want to do this at least once a week. Make sure that you are kind of filtering out your potting mix. One of the problems with growing in containers is that fertilizers can be built up within your potting mix, and you're going to want to make sure that you're kind of flushing that out continuously throughout the growing season. So when you are watering, you want to make sure one of the ways that these can become problems is wetting your foliage, especially if it's later in the afternoon and your plants are sitting there with water on their leaves overnight. And that's typically where you can see disease issues rising or arising. You also want to make sure that you are not overwatering too. That can also be a problem because it will reduce the airspace in your potting mix and can actually reduce plant growth and lead to other problems as well. So if you are in kind of a balcony situation or one where you're using saucers to collect the water that is draining out of your containers, you want to make sure that you're emptying those after each watering so your plant's not sitting continuously in water. Also, you want to make sure that you're not allowing your plants to wilt in between watering. This can actually lead to other problems, which we'll talk more about here in a minute, but it actually stresses out the plants and again can lead to other issues down the road. So a funny thing, most of the issues that gardeners face during the growing season, they're actually not pest related. And so some of the most you will see is that in containers, you're either facing your plants too close or your container is too small, which again will lead to growth issues and development issues during the season. Also, if you're watering too much or maybe you're watering not enough, you can have flower and fruit drop. You can also have root rot issues. So these are all things that you need to be mindful of during the growing season. And the last one is nutrient deficiencies. Now with this particular one, this can be a problem due to underwatering or maybe overwatering or not supplying the nutrients in an appropriate fashion, not really following your label directions on your particular formulation. So all things to keep in mind during the growing season. It might not be a pest-related problem. We do, however, want to talk about pests. Unfortunately, some of the same pests that affect vegetables grown in an in-ground garden do affect vegetables grown in a container setting. However, most of the time, this is a little less often, and you're not necessarily going to see the same numbers as you would in a in-ground garden situation. But you do want to make sure that you're inspecting your plants quite regularly. You're going to want to look at the leaves, look at the stems, make sure that you're not seeing your plant looking unhealthy. And it's just good practice to check your plant. So the reason I say this is because most pest issues, if they're caught early enough, can actually be controlled in an easy fashion and you'll have good control at the end. It is highly recommended that if you're not quite sure what your pest problem is, that you refrain from using chemicals until you have proper identification. And if you're ever in doubt, make sure to reach out to your local extension service. They will be happy to help you with whatever problems you might be having. So the first pest issue that I really want to look at is some diseases that you will see, such as leaf spots, stem and root rots, and wilts. One way to circumvent some of these issues is make sure that you're using disease-resistant seeds and you're also using healthy transplants. Using these from the get-go will make your growing season go a lot smoother. Also, depending on what is affecting your plant, it is possible that you can remove the diseased leaves or you can just take that plant out altogether and it'll slowly eventually work itself out. Now, there are some insect pests, and some of the common ones include stink or leaf-footed bugs. You also have aphids and mites, beetles, and worms. Now, to know whether or not you have these, you will need to inspect your plants quite regularly. Again, check your leaves, top and bottom. Check your stems and fruits as well. See if you can actually catch the culprit. Important point to note, stink and leaf-footed bugs, aphids and mites have piercing and sucking mouth parts. So as you'll see on the picture on the left, this is a spider mite problem, and you can typically see these through the webbing. They're kind of small to the eye, but seeing that webbing is a good indication that you have spider mite. Also, beetles and worms have cutting or chewing mouth parts. So if you see spots missing out of the leaves of your plants, you know that you need to be on the lookout for these particular insects. And oftentimes they can be controlled quite easily. You can pick them off and unfortunately you can squish them, or if that is not your choice, then you can also put them in alcohol or just throw them on the ground. Also, you can use your water hose and knock them off. Sometimes this is really effective with aphids as well. Again, make sure you have proper identification before you decide to control these particular pests. And if you're ever in doubt, reach out for help. But again, most of these can be controlled quite easily. Now, while we're looking at pests, let's talk a little bit about beneficials. Not all the insects that you will find on your plants are there to necessarily harm them. You might see pollinators, which will be your bees, your flies, your wasps. You might have predators who are out there eating the bad insects. And you might also have parasitoids. Now, parasitoids are going to mostly be from the wasp family, and they're going to be depositing their eggs on some of the bad guys. So be on the lookout for some of these beneficials, such as your bees, your flies, your wasps, also your ladybugs. The picture in the top right-hand corner is a green lacewing. Also, soldier beetles and assassin bugs. These are all your friends, and you want to make sure that these are not harmed in any control process or application. So last, let's talk a little bit about harvest, and then we should be done for the day, and I'll be glad to answer any questions that you might have. So when it comes to harvest, this is going to vary depending on which vegetable crop that you are growing. But typically you can find this information again on the back of your seed packets and your transplant tags. You can also find this information through your extension office or online. But keeping track of what's going on with your vegetables during the growing season, you'll get indications throughout that you are on the horizon for harvest. And so one of the advantages of actually growing your vegetable crops at home is that you can harvest them when they are mature and full of flavor. And that is one of the reasons a lot of people like to grow their own vegetables, especially tomatoes. They just have a different taste than the ones that you can find at your local grocery store. So a key note is that after harvest, you really want to make sure that you're discarding your plants and you're not leaving them in the containers, because this can lead to disease and pest issues for your remaining plants. And it is highly recommended too that you replace your potting mix after one growing season. If you haven't seen any disease issues during let's say your spring or summer season and you want to use it again for fall, you could possibly do so and not have disease carry over. But after 2 growing seasons, you really want to throw it out or discard it and not use it again for your 3rd growing season. So just a few things to remember: that for a successful container garden, you really are going to want to make sure that you are checking them daily for water needs. One of the biggest problems with container gardens is that they're not watered regularly and frequently enough, and that the whole container is not getting watered. You also want to make sure that you're routinely and frequently inspecting for plant pests and diseases during the growing season. Again, if you can catch them early, control is going to be a lot easier. Also, you want to make sure that you are monitoring or checking your location for adequate light and excess heat. It's possible if you are getting too much heat from your particular location, you could move it a few feet over or to another location, but you want to make sure that you catch that early and not later. And lastly, you want to make sure that you're making the most out of the seasons. So just like with in-ground garden, you can garden throughout the seasons. You can do the same with a container garden as well. So you can have a spring/summer garden and a fall garden and a winter garden and just carry on throughout the seasons, really getting the most out of your container garden. All right, well, that is all that I had for today. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I will be glad to stick around and see if I can answer any of your questions.
Okay, Ashley, that was awesome. So Ashley Hoppers and I have tried to address some repeat questions that y'all had, but Ashley, did you want me to kind of bring up some questions that a lot of people had?
Yeah, sure, that would be great.
First, I have two definitions. If you could clarify, what do you mean by cultivar, and is it the same as a variety?
So a cultivated variety, or cultivar, as we call it for short, is a particular name that they give to certain vegetables or plants that have been developed. And so through select breeding and other methods of genetics, they have come up with particular ones. Again, these are going to be your named vegetables. So, like the list that I was showing earlier for beets, how it has a direct name associated with it, like Detroit dark red, that's going to be that particular name for that particular variety of beets. And so certain ones do better in certain areas. Did that help clarify that any without being too technical?
Perfect. Thank you. And then can you just briefly review what you meant by plant filtering? We had a couple folks asking about that.
About the fertilizer filtering?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so one of the things that happens in a container situation is that you can have buildup throughout the growing season. And when it comes to fertilizers, especially salts, can be built up in your potting mix. And so you're wanting to make sure that you're flushing those out on a regular basis, roughly about once a week or once every 2 weeks, just to make sure that you're not having salt built up in your potting mix, which can eventually harm your plants. So an easy way to remedy that situation is just to make sure when you are watering that you're watering your containers enough that water is draining out the bottom.
Okay, perfect. We also had a lot of questions about squirrels. How do you deal with squirrels and other vertebrate pests with your containers?
So that is actually a really good question. We actually have, I say we, UGA Extension has a really good publication on Pest that covers those particular ones. I have had problems with squirrels in the past digging in my containers, and unfortunately, I do not have an answer that is 100% proof that this will work. I do know that there are sprays available, like pepper sprays, that you can potentially spray on and around your plants that is supposed to deter the squirrels. But again, after a few waterings, a few rain events, unfortunately, they will be back. So again, there's no 100% control for that, except you could possibly try and move them to a different location and just keep a lookout for those particular pests.
Okay, great. So we had a couple questions about green onions, folks growing them in water versus soil. Do you have any recommendations for that, Ashley?
Unfortunately, I do not have recommendations for that. Honestly, whatever works best for you. I mean, everybody has different methods when it comes to gardening. And so I don't really, yeah, this works or no, this works better answer for you. Again, experimenting with gardening is always the fun part of it. And so you find something that works for you, stick with it. It might not necessarily work for someone else.
Very true. What's your opinion on self-waterers for containers?
My opinion on self-waterers. I don't really know if I have a yay or nay on that either. I know for your herbs, it works well. But I'm one of those people that I love plants. So I like going out and checking my plants, and I like the process of watering. And so I don't typically use self waterers with mine. I also like sticking my fingers in the potting soil just because I like playing with dirt. So again, some things work for some gardeners and not so much with others. I also feel like with self waterers, sometimes you can, I guess, forget that you need to go out and check your plants. And so when it comes to growing vegetables, I feel like you need to check them quite regularly. And one way to do that is checking them for water. And it's a good time to inspect your plants for pests and things like that as well. So neither yay or nay on that, just whatever works best for you to make sure that your plants are getting the water that they need.
Okay. Thank you. People ask if you can reuse your old soil in your compost heap.
Yes, actually, you can discard your potting mix in your compost heap. That is actually a really good way to discard of it and use it again down the road. So that is actually a really good point and a good option.
Cool. Somebody asked if any common vegetables are toxic to pests. They specifically, or pets like dogs. They mentioned tomatoes and other nightshades specifically.
So that is a good question. Are the pests necessarily feeding on the foliage, or are they eating the fruit?
The leaves, like if a dog were to eat the tomato leaves.
I've actually not encountered this problem, so I don't know if I necessarily have the best answer for that. I would suggest that they check with their local extension office to get a little bit more information on that.
Yeah, I think the nightshade family, if you eat a couple of the leaves, that can be, it'll probably make it throw up. But yeah,
Right.
nightshade plants definitely keep away.
Yeah, for sure. And it's all going to depend on how much that they eat. Unfortunately, I've not run into that situation where a homeowner has had a pest eat that particular plant, but no, it's not good for humans. I do know that much.
Mm-hmm.
So,
We had a couple questions about like recycled plastic containers. Do plastic containers leach toxins into the soil?
so I have not come across where that has been an issue unless that particular container has previously stored toxic chemicals. Of course, if it has stored toxic chemicals, you want to stay away from that particular container for use for growing your food crops. But no, I've not come across where plastics will leach into your potting mix and be problems for your plants.
Okay.
And if you're ever in doubt, you can always line your particular container. Again, you want to stay away from those that have held toxic chemicals, but also treated wood as well. And a good way to kind of circumvent that is you can line your particular container.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So question on, I'm trying to focus on the container gardening vegetable questions. So someone has, I know this is herbs technically, but I'm going to throw this at you. Someone has mint growing in containers. What should they do about amending their soil each year?
So that is a good question. When it comes to mint, and you might want to actually throw your 2 cents in as well on this one. Mint is, I love mint, and it is actually one of the herbs that my kids love as well. And so I make sure to grow it every year. I actually have some chocolate mint on my back deck right now, which is trying to take over the world. But generally, I don't mess with my mint too much. I keep an eye on it, make sure that it stays healthy. But I actually have not had to amend the soil for my particular mint plants in the past. What do you typically do with your mint?
Yeah, typically I may shake out some of the old soil and then add some new potting soil every year.
Right.
I don't usually add fertilizer or anything like that. Mint is very hard to kill.
Yeah, I know. So true.
Okay, cool. Well, Ashley, I don't know if you can see the Q&A. We are at 1:30 now, so you're welcome to kind of take a look back through some of the ones we didn't get. I am still posting the survey link in the chat. Did you want me to keep going through and giving you questions, or did you want to look, Ashley?
Sure, shoot away. I don't mind answering questions for a little bit longer if anybody has any pressing ones.
Oh, awesome. Okay, cool. Do have some housekeeping questions. Can you see the previous webinars? Yes, we've posted the archives. We will post archives to this. Got a couple people saying they're new to gardening. Awesome. Ashley, can you talk a little bit about potentially companion planting in containers?
So I do know that people do companion planting in containers, and it is possible. So I don't necessarily have any recommendations on that, generally because most of the time homeowners are going to use containers that can only fit that particular food crop in the pot, and so there's not generally room. Now, my mother-in-law, on the other hand, and my husband's grandmothers, of course, like to grow marigolds with their tomatoes. And so there is potential for growing companion plants with those. And unfortunately, I didn't have time to address those. And those would probably be more of another webinar series. But there is the potential for that as long as you have a container that is large enough to hold and provide the adequate spacing that your particular crops do need. For both your companion plant and your food crop.
Okay, great. Let's see. We've got a couple questions. A lot of folks are trying to grow curry. Ashley, are you familiar with curry at all, and how easy it is to grow in containers and some problems?
So I have actually not tried to grow curry myself. I know that was a question kind of brought up in our last webinar session. Have you tried to grow curry, Melissa?
I haven't. So with curry, you need a lot of sunlight. I do know that. Hot and warm is what it really likes.
Right.
Much beyond that.
That is not an experiment I've taken under my belt as of yet, but I would be interested to know more about it. And so I'll try to do some research and see what I can find on that particular one.
Okay. So let's see. Okay. I love how many people are new to gardening here.
I know, that's great.
We've got about 4 people mentioning that they've got mushrooms growing in their containers. So what gives?
You know, there's a good chance that that was already inoculated in their potting mix. And so, especially if it was an older potting mix and depending on what the ingredients were on that. And so most of the time, those mushrooms are not going to be a problem for your food crop that you are trying to grow. They are just unsightly. And so you can try adding some new potting mix to the container to see if you can get those mushrooms out of there. But honestly, unless you're seeing a decline in your plant, you should be okay.
Okay. Had a couple folks asking about when they need to start thinking about their fall container garden.
That is actually a really good question. And again, those timings for your growing in your container versus growing an in-ground garden, you want to stick to the same time frame. So if you're thinking about what you're wanting to grow for fall, I generally recommend start looking at that in the summer. You know, if there's a certain type of vegetable that you're trying to grow that's not readily available at your local garden centers or nurseries, you want to be looking at your seed catalogs and making sure that you can order those and get those in time. And really, it's a good recommendation to sit down in the summer a few months before and make sure that you have everything planned out. Again, one of those very basic steps, make sure you have a plan, what, when, where, several months before you plan on implementing in that, so you can make sure that you have the right foundation in place before getting started.
Great. Do you sterilize your pots at the end of the season when you're done using them?
So that is actually a really good recommendation, and yes, probably one I should have brought up during my presentation. But yes, it is generally recommended that you sterilize your pots between the different growing seasons, just in case you have any disease pressures that have arisen during your growing season. You can make sure that you're not carrying that on into your next growing season. So yes, sterilization is highly recommended in between growing your different crops.
Okay. And what size pot do you think potatoes should grow in?
So potatoes, that is a really good question. I know a few that have tried growing potatoes in grow bags, but honestly, I have used those large plastic storage containers that you can find at most of the department stores. One that holds several gallons is the size that you're going to be wanting to look for when it comes to growing potatoes. And so you want to make sure that it's at least several inches deep to make sure that you have enough room and space for your potatoes to grow adequate number of potatoes off the root system. And so again, one of those big storage lugs that a person can pick up by themselves. And unfortunately, I don't know the size measurements on that, but
yeah, and it probably depends on the type of potatoes too. So
right. But you want to make sure it's several gallons for sure.
Yeah.
5 and above.
Okay, great. Ashley, so how are you feeling? Do you want to go ahead? It's 1:37 now. So we have a couple options. Richie, I think we can pull the questions down from the chat and we can send a follow-up email answering some of the questions we didn't get to. Is this possible?
Yeah, sure. We can do that.
Okay. Ashley, are you tired of answering questions yet, or you want to keep going?
I mean, no, that's fine. I just want to put in a final plug. If you have any gardening questions, identification questions, disease questions, make sure you're reaching out to your local extension office. We are here to help you, and they will have a better idea of what your particular situation is and how to guide you.
Yeah, that's a great point. And y'all don't forget, I've posted the survey several times in the chat. So if you could fill that out, that would be great. And I think just because we're still getting even more questions. So let's see, let's do 2 or 3 more and then we can call it a day and close out. How about that?
Yeah, that'll be fine.
Okay. So if someone has an outdoor garden box, should they completely empty out all of the soil before the fall plantings?
So an outdoor garden box, any clue, is it an in-ground garden or is it a raised box garden? I'm not, sorry, I'm trying to
That's Alicia.
Figure out what's.
Yeah, it's a raised box, so like a raised bed.
Okay, so if you have a raised bed garden, unfortunately, that is not going to be feasible. And so Generally, you do not have to replenish that. Now, during the growing seasons, after you've gone through a few, you will eventually need to possibly add either some kind of soil amendment, topsoil, raised bed potting mix back into your container, but it's not necessarily one of those situations where you can necessarily replenish it after each growing season. And so unless you're seeing serious problems in that, then no, you wouldn't need to start again each growing season, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me see. Okay. Just missed that. What do you line your containers with when you line them?
So there's actually fabric out there that you can purchase from some of the nurseries and garden centers that you can use to line like raised beds or your containers. If you're questioning whether or not it is safe. Now, again, back to those containers that have held toxic chemicals or have been pre-treated with, you know, the different preservatives for wood, you want to make sure to stay away from those for sure, whether it's in a container or raised bed situation. But again, if you want to be on the safe side, you can always line those with some garden fabric, and you should be okay.
Okay. And then one final question, is it too late to plant lettuce and other leafy greens?
So leafy greens, unfortunately, it is getting toward that time of year where it is getting too warm for those particular crops. Now you can wait until fall and try to grow those then as a fall crop, and they will probably do great. But because, again, we're reaching into summertime now, those generally don't do good during this time of year. And so you generally want to plant those early spring and late fall. Those are more of a cool season crop.
Okay, great. So I think that's all the time, Ashley, if you're okay with it, that we're going to spend with questions. It's been about 15 minutes on questions.
Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you for asking those.
Oh yeah, no problem. You did the same for me on herbs. So it's time for me to return the favor. Got a little overwhelming. Y'all had great questions though. Ashley, are there any other upcoming programs that you would like to plug real quick? And then I will go after you and close it out.
Yeah, sure. So make sure that you're staying tuned for our third session of the Container Gardening webinar series, which will be next Tuesday. We'll be talking, or you will be talking about ornamentals. So I'm super excited about that. And also this week, we have 2 sessions coming up for backyard fruit production. We'll have muscadines and strawberries. So if you're interested in learning more about backyard fruit production, make sure that you tune into that as well. So thank you, Melissa.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ashley. And thank you, Ashley Hoppers, for helping me answer the questions. Very sorry if we didn't get to yours. We had well over 100, so we tried to. Like Ashley said, our final installment of the Container Gardening series is next Tuesday at 12:30 p.m., same time, same place. We're going to do a similar setup where you're going to get the link emailed to you at around 11 or 11:30. And we're going to be talking about ornamentals as well as pollinator plants. It's not just rose bushes and things like that. Ornamental plants are important for pollinators too. So tune into that. You will automatically receive the link next week, just like you did today. With that, a lot of you asked how to contact your local county extension office. I will say we have not begun to open up yet. So many county extension offices are closed throughout the state still. But if you Google your cooperative extension office, your county name and cooperative extension, it should be the first result to pop up. And you can email your A&R agent, your Agriculture and Natural Resources agent, that you find on that webpage. If you have any problems, you can also contact us and we can connect you. as well. So like I said, we're going to rip the chat and answer the questions and send those back out in the follow-up email. This has been recorded, so we will also distribute that on our event page in Facebook and via emails if we can get a link for that. And if there are no other housekeeping questions, then we will hopefully see you all next week.